This isn't about Canada, and it's definitely not about China. This is about who controls North America's future. Stay with me. When Donald Trump threatened 100% tariffs on Canada, most people shrugged. Another trade fight, another headline. But let me be clear, that reaction is exactly why this matters, because tariffs at that level aren't policy, they're a weapon. Here's the key point. The US, Canada, and Mexico don't just trade with each other, they're fused together. One supply chain, one production loop, a single car sold in America, parts cross the border 6 to 8 times before it's finished. Steel from Canada, components from Mexico, final assembly in the US. Now imagine dropping a 100% tax into that system. That's not pressure on Canada. That's a wrench thrown into the engine. Factories slow down, costs explode. Companies don't absorb that hit. You do. Higher car prices, more expensive appliances, supply delays, job uncertainty, cause and effect, simple, brutal. So why do it? Because this isn't about economics. It's about leverage. Trump's message isn't let's negotiate, it's fall in line. Tariffs force a choice, play by Washington's rules or pay the price. And this is where the stakes jump. If the U.S. normalizes using tariffs against its closest ally, then no trade relationship is safe, not Europe, not Asia, not Mexico. The world starts planning around America, not with America. Supply chains reroute, alliances shift, and U.S. influence quietly shrinks. That's the irony. A move meant to show strength can actually weaken America's long-term power, short-term dominance, long-term consequences. So this isn't a Canada story. It's a warning about how quickly economic weapons can turn inward, about how fast cooperation can collapse into coercion. And the real question isn't whether Canada will blink. The real question is this: how much disruption are Americans willing to pay for power plays, and who actually wins when the bill comes due? It's 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Markets are open, phones start buzzing, and then this drops. Donald Trump steps out and says it. Not 25%, not 50%, 100% tariffs on every Canadian product. Let that land. That's not a warning shot. That's a sledgehammer. And the reason he gives, Canada's relationship with China. But stay with me, because that explanation doesn't hold. Here's the line you need to hear twice. 100% tariffs, not 25, not 50, straight up double prices. That means if it crossed the border yesterday at $1, today it walks in at $2. Cars, steel, energy, food. This wasn't said quietly. This wasn't leaked. This was deliberate. And the moment he said it, the clock started ticking, not for Canada, for the American consumer. Because when prices double overnight, someone always pays. And in the next minute, I'm going to explain why this move has almost nothing to do with China and everything to do with who controls North America next. Stay with me. You don't threaten 100% tariffs over nothing. There's a trigger, and this is it. After 8 years, a Canadian Prime Minister goes to China. Not a Zoom call, not a trade envoy. The Prime Minister himself, Mark Carney, lands in Beijing, sits down face to face with Xi Jinping. That alone raised eyebrows in Washington. But what really set off alarms was the deal that came out of that room. Let me break it down clean. First, Chinese electric vehicles. China gets approval to send 49,000 EVs every single year into Canada. And the tariff? 6.1%. Not 25, not 50. 6. Now compare that to the U.S. position, where Chinese EVs are basically blocked. That's gap number 1. Now flip the trade. Canada's exports to China, canola, a massive Canadian industry, tariffs slashed from 85% down to 15%. That's not symbolic. That's a green light. And seafood, lobster, crab, shellfish, 0 tariffs, straight through. So pause here. China gets EV market access in North America. Canada gets massive export relief. Both sides win. But here's the key point. America wasn't in the room, and that's what changed the game. From Washington's perspective, this isn't just Canada trading. This is Canada diverging, building an economic lane that doesn't run through the U.S., and once that happens, the idea of a unified North American trade front starts cracking. That's when tariffs stop being economic tools and start becoming pressure tactics. So when Trump says China, what he really means is control. Control over supply chains, control over allies, control over who gets access to this market. And that's why this moment matters, because if Canada can cut its own deal with Beijing, what stops others from doing the same? And that's where this stops being about trade and starts being about power. Next, I'll show you why the U.S. response wasn't negotiation. It was a warning shot. Stay with me. Canada looks calm from the outside, but inside, it's fractured. Let me show you how. Out west, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, farmers are celebrating. And I mean really celebrating. Canola was dying, prices crushed, exports blocked. Then China drops tariffs from 85% to 15%. That's not a policy tweak, that's a revival. Farm income jumps, orders return, fields that were barely profitable suddenly matter again. For these farmers, this deal isn't geopolitical, it's survival. But now, flip the country. Head east to Ontario, auto country, factories, unions, supply chains tied directly to the U.S. And over there, rage. Because Chinese EVs aren't being called competition, they're being called spy cars. That's the phrase, not mine, theirs. Why? Because modern EVs aren't just cars. They're rolling computers, sensors, cameras, data collectors. Ontario's auto industry sees this as an invasion, cheap Chinese vehicles entering the market while American and Canadian automakers are locked out of China. So now Canada has a problem. Farmers saying, don't touch this deal, it saved us. Auto workers saying, this deal sells us out. Two economies, two priorities, one country. And here's the key point. Listen closely. A divided Canada is easier to pressure. When Trump threatens 100% tariffs, he's not just talking to Ottawa. He's talking to Ontario, to labor unions, to auto CEOs. He's betting that internal pressure will force Canada to blink. That's how leverage works. And once a country starts fighting itself, external pressure hits harder. So this isn't just a trade conflict, it's a stress test on Canada's unity, on North America's alignment, and on how far economic weapons can push allies apart. And next, I'll explain why the U.S. response wasn't diplomacy. It was a message. Stay with me. This is where things stop being quiet. The World Economic Forum, Davos, the room where elites usually whisper. But this time, Mark Carney didn't whisper. He stood up and said something that cut through the noise. We are in a rupture, not a transition. That's not optimism, that's a warning. He followed it with a line that made half the room sit up straight. If we're not at the table, we're on the menu. Let me be clear about what that means. Carney wasn't talking about theory. He was talking about U.S. tariffs, about economic pressure being used not to negotiate, but to coerce. And then he went further. He said middle powers, countries like Canada, can't survive alone in this system. They have to band together, coordinate, resist being picked off one by one. That was the message. And Washington heard it because the response came fast. Donald Trump brushed Canada aside, dismissive, cold. He said, and this is almost word for word, Canada lives because of the United States. Think about that sentence. Not trades with, not partners with, lives because of. That's not alliance language. That's hierarchy language. And this is where Carney snapped back. No yelling, no theatrics, just one line. Canada thrives because it is Canadian. That was it. But that line mattered because in one sentence, this stopped being about tariffs and became about sovereignty, about whether allies get a seat at the table or get told to sit down and comply. Davos made one thing clear. This isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't noise. This is a clash between coercion and independence, between pressure and partnership. And now the question isn't whether tensions cool down. The question is, what happens when allies stop whispering and start pushing back? Because once that line is crossed, there's no going back. First, the fallout. Donald Trump cuts Mark Carney out of the so-called Board of Peace. Then come the social media shots, dismissive, personal, and then boom, the 100% tariff threat. Let me be clear, this wasn't random. This was escalation, ego clash, economic weapon. That's the sequence. When leaders stop arguing in rooms and start arguing in public, policy hardens into punishment. And now we hit the real game, the part you have to understand. Put this date on screen, put it in bold. July 1st, 2026. That's the mandatory review of U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. If the review fails, the agreement doesn't just wobble, it enters collapse mode. Here's Trump's play. He wants tighter rules, harder enforcement, and one non-negotiable condition: China stays out completely. No components, no side routes, no loopholes. Canada and Mexico don't get flexibility. They get alignment. Same line, same rules, same enemy. That's why the tariff threat landed now, not last year, not next year. Leverage before the review. This is pressure ahead of the deadline. Washington's suspicion is simple. China doesn't ship straight to the U.S. It routes. China, Canada, or Mexico, U.S. factories do minimal work, final assembly, new label, then duty-free access into the American market. That's the nightmare scenario, and the data backs the fear. Chinese investment is rising fast. EVs, steel, electronics. Not headlines, infrastructure. So when Trump says tariffs, what he means is shut the door. Here's the line that explains everything. Canada isn't moving closer to China because China is good. It's doing it because America has become unreliable. 75% of Canada's exports go to the U.S. That's not partnership. That's dependence. And dependence becomes dangerous when policy changes every election. Carney's calculation is cold, not ideological. Diversify or be cornered. His target? By 2030, increase exports to China by 50%, not to replace the U.S., but to survive it. Because from Ottawa's view, tariffs today can become blockades tomorrow. So here's the truth. Stripped clean. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's not about speeches. It's not even about China. It's about who sets the rules when the biggest trade deal in North America comes up for renewal. Coercion or coordination, pressure or partnership. And the question that decides everything is this. When July 1st, 2026 arrives, will North America still be a bloc, or will it fracture under force? That's the moment this story has been racing toward. And now you know why it matters. Let's drop the politics for a second and talk numbers, because numbers don't care about ego. Every single day, $3 billion worth of goods cross the U.S.-Canada border. Daily, not yearly, daily. Now hear this part carefully. 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada, not the Middle East, not Venezuela, Canada. And electricity, 85% of U.S. electricity imports come from Canada. So when people say, just slap tariffs on Canada, what they're really saying is raise energy costs, raise manufacturing costs, raise household bills, cause effect. Tariffs go up, input costs spike. Companies don't eat that loss, you do. Gas gets pricier, factories slow or shut down, layoffs follow. And when consumption drops, investment freezes. That's how inflation turns into recession, not theory, history. This isn't pain over there. This lands inside the U.S. economy. There are only three paths forward, no fourth option. Option one, Trump backs off, pressure works, tariffs get paused, negotiations resume, markets breathe, but credibility damage stays. Option two, Canada blinks, Ottawa tightens rules, distances itself from China, falls back in line, short-term stability, long-term resentment. Option three, trade war, no retreat, no compromise, tariffs trigger counter-tariffs, supply chains break, economic shock spreads. That's when leverage turns into crisis. Let me be blunt. Trade wars don't have winners. They only decide who bleeds first. Everything you've heard so far is a setup for one date, July 1st, 2026. That's the review of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. If that review collapses, the agreement doesn't limp forward, it unravels. And this entire fight, the China deal, the Davos clash, the ego shots, the tariff threat, it all leads here. This is leverage ahead of renegotiation, pressure before rules are rewritten. So when Donald Trump talks about tariffs, he's not looking backward, he's shaping the battlefield for what comes next. So here's the final line, don't miss it. This isn't just a fight between Canada and the United States. It's a test of whether rules still matter more than raw power. Because if power wins, rules don't matter. And if rules collapse, the next shock won't be a headline. It'll be your bill, your job, your economy. And the real question is this. When July 2026 arrives, will North America still be playing by rules or by force? Stay sharp.